In the dense, unforgiving forests of Alaska, a mystery has haunted investigators for nearly a decade. In August 2022, two workers stumbled upon an eerie, almost otherworldly discovery, an abandoned cabin high up in the trees. As they ventured inside, the sight that awaited them was nothing short of chilling. A human skeleton wedged in the corner as though it had been carefully placed there. But that wasn't the strangest part. The door was boarded up from the inside. How had this man ended up trapped? And why couldn't he escape? To unravel this chilling tale, we need to go back to 2013, when the story began with the disappearance of Patrick O'Hara, a methodical hiker, prepared for anything, except for what he was about to encounter in the wild, lonely woods of Ketchikan. But what really happened to Patrick? Was it a tragic accident? Or was something darker lurking in the depths of the Tongass National Forest? Before we dive into this haunting story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with anyone who loves a good mystery. You won't want to miss what's coming next. In the summer of 2013, Patrick O'Hara, an IT specialist from Vancouver, set out on what was supposed to be an adventure of a lifetime. A seasoned traveler, he was no stranger to the wilds of British Columbia and Alaska. But this journey would take him into the heart of one of the most isolated, unpredictable places on Earth, the Tongass National Forest. The Tongass is an expanse of nearly 17 million acres, with dense forests, rugged terrain, and unpredictable weather. It's one of the largest temperate rainforests in the world, where fog can roll in so thick even the most experienced hikers can get lost in an instant. Patrick was a methodical hiker. He knew how to navigate, how to survive, and most importantly, he respected the wild. His gear was meticulously planned, right down to the brand of gas canisters for his stove and the exact amount of freeze-dried food for the 10-day journey he had in mind. But this wasn't a typical hike. Patrick was venturing off the beaten path. He had chosen a section of the coastal route rarely visited by tourists, seeking solitude and a deeper connection with nature. His goal was to explore the wild heart of the Tongass, far away from any roads, crowds, or established trails. On July 12th, before setting off, Patrick stopped by a small tourist shop in Ketchikan. The shop owner, Gary, remembers Patrick as an experienced traveler, calm and confident in his preparations. Nothing about Patrick seemed out of place. Patrick's last communication was a brief text to his sister saying he was about to hit the trail. He mentioned he'd check in again in 8 days. It was standard procedure for him. Patrick had done solo hikes for years. His family trusted him and knew that in the remote wilderness, communication could be spotty at best. Days passed. July 20th came and went without word from Patrick, but his family wasn't worried. After all, Patrick had planned for this. He'd built in a buffer of 2 extra days in case something delayed his journey. By July 22nd, when no word had arrived, his family began to feel uneasy. A call was made to the Alaska State Police, and a search effort was launched. The next day, a team of experienced volunteers from Ketchikan joined the search, familiar with the difficult terrain and harsh conditions. The searchers knew the stakes. In Tongass, even in summer, the cold and wet could lead to hypothermia. Bears, including grizzlies, roamed the area. If Patrick had broken his leg or injured himself, his chances of survival would have been slim to none. Search teams combed the dense forests, but progress was agonizingly slow. Helicopters were dispatched, but the thick clouds and towering trees blocked any aerial view of the forest floor. On the ground, the searchers moved carefully, calling out and signaling, but the only responses were the sounds of rain and birds. For days, the search turned up nothing. The woods seemed to have swallowed Patrick whole. His absence began to weigh heavily on those searching, and hope was fading. But then, on the 7th day of searching, something remarkable happened. A team of rescuers stumbled upon Patrick's camp. The scene was eerily calm. His tent was neatly packed, his sleeping bag and gear folded. It didn't look like the sight of someone who had been in distress. The tent was rolled up perfectly, as if it had been taken down by an experienced hand. There were no signs of struggle, no scattered food or broken equipment, nothing that would suggest an urgent or panicked departure. The only clue was the backpack, which was left behind, neatly packed, but without Patrick. The absence of any signs of a struggle was both strange and unsettling. Forensic experts arrived, puzzled by the orderly state of the camp. How could a seasoned hiker, knowing the wilderness so well, have left behind his most important gear, his food, and his map? It made no sense. Patrick couldn't have gone far without his essentials. The rescuers scoured the surrounding area for any trace of Patrick, but they found nothing. No footprints, no blood, no signs of a struggle. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The search continued, but it became increasingly clear that this was no ordinary disappearance. As the days wore on, the search transitioned into a more somber phase. Authorities began to prepare for the worst, thinking they were looking for a body rather than a missing person. Yet, despite their best efforts, there was no trace of Patrick. By the end of the second week, the official search was called off. Patrick O'Hara was declared missing, and his case was filed away as unsolved. The haunting thought lingered in the minds of everyone involved. What could have happened to this experienced hiker, someone who knew the wilderness and was prepared for everything? As the weeks turned into months and then years, Patrick's disappearance became one of the many mysteries that were whispered about in Ketchikan. His case was filed away in the archives, his family left with no answers, and the forest kept its secret. Yet, the strange, unsettling nature of Patrick's disappearance stayed in the minds of those who knew about it. It seemed like something out of a ghost story. No one could explain how a man so prepared could simply vanish without a trace, leaving only his packed-up gear behind. Years passed, and while the case went cold, the legend of Patrick O'Hara lingered in the small community. No one forgot about him. His name was mentioned every so often when a stranger would ask about the mysteries of the Tongass, and the locals would shake their heads in wonder. But little did anyone know, the story of Patrick O'Hara was far from over. 9 years later, the mystery would resurface in a way that no one could have ever expected, and the forest would finally reveal the truth. The discovery would raise more questions than answers, and a chilling new chapter in the tale of Patrick O'Hara would begin. But before we uncover the truth, we must first revisit the forest, the trees, and the haunting mystery of that abandoned cabin. As the search for Patrick O'Hara began, the Alaska State Police mobilized a team of volunteers and experts from Ketchikan, well-versed in the dangerous terrain of the Tongass National Forest. They knew the forest well. The dense trees and foggy weather made navigation a constant challenge. Even the most experienced rescuers found themselves disoriented in the vastness of the wilderness. Time was running out, and every minute counted. The search parties worked tirelessly, day after day, covering as much ground as they could. They combed through the thick, wet forest, calling Patrick's name, hoping for a sign, any sign, that he was still alive. As helicopters flew overhead, the fog and towering trees obstructed their view of the forest floor. The weather made it nearly impossible to spot anything from above, leaving the rescuers to work from the ground. The searchers were well aware of the dangers. In such cold, wet conditions, hypothermia could set in quickly, even in the summer. If Patrick had fallen and been injured, his chances of survival were slim. Local volunteers, many of whom had hiked these forests before, guided the search. They knew how to navigate the terrain, but the thick undergrowth and constant rain made progress slow and difficult. The forest was relentless. The deeper they went into the forest, the more hopeless the situation seemed. There were no signs, no footprints, nothing to suggest Patrick had even been there. The forest was eerily silent, as if hiding its secrets. For a week, the rescuers continued their search, slowly covering more ground. They shouted Patrick's name, used flares to signal, but the only responses they received were the sounds of rain falling on the forest floor. With each passing day, hope began to dwindle. The thick forest and unpredictable weather were proving to be an insurmountable barrier. It seemed as though the wilderness had swallowed Patrick whole, and the team began to fear the worst. The frustration of the rescuers mounted as they found nothing. The weeks dragged on, with no sign of life and no indication of where Patrick might have gone. Yet, the team refused to give up hope. Despite the overwhelming odds, the search continued. With every new day, the volunteers and police were determined to uncover any trace of the missing hiker. They refused to let the forest claim another victim without a fight. Then, on the 7th day, a breakthrough. One of the search groups came across an unexpected discovery. In a small clearing, they found a campsite. It was Patrick's tent, neatly packed, with no signs of distress. The tent had been folded up carefully, packed as if it had been taken down by someone who knew what they were doing. The sleeping bag, clothes, and gear were neatly folded, ready to be packed away. The scene didn't match the chaotic situation of someone lost or in distress. Everything was organized almost too perfectly. It was as though Patrick had packed up his camp and left. But where had he gone? Nearby, the backpack lay, fully packed and untouched. The forensic experts were puzzled. Why would Patrick leave his food, his map, and all of his survival gear behind? It didn't add up. The question lingered. What had happened? The search continued, with teams scouring the surrounding area. Yet, despite their best efforts, no trace of Patrick was found. It was as if he had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his neatly packed belongings. The volunteers and investigators grew more desperate. The forest, with its dense undergrowth and towering trees, seemed to conceal every clue. Each step forward felt like a step backward, as if the wilderness itself was hiding the truth. As the search turned up nothing, the authorities began to question the circumstances surrounding Patrick's disappearance. How could an experienced hiker disappear so completely, without a single sign of struggle or any trail to follow? The search teams, frustrated and tired, continued to comb through the forest for days. Yet, despite their relentless efforts, the forest refused to yield any answers. It was a mystery that seemed impossible to solve. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of Patrick. The searchers had covered every inch of the area, but nothing had been found. It was as though the forest had swallowed him whole, and no one could explain why. With the search effort winding down, hope began to fade. The authorities had done everything they could, but there was still no sign of Patrick. It was as if the wilderness had claimed him, and no one would ever know the truth. But the search for Patrick O'Hara was far from over. Little did the rescuers know, the forest held on to its secrets for a reason. The mystery of his disappearance would only grow more complicated, and the truth was closer than anyone imagined. 9 years passed, and Patrick O'Hara's case faded into the background. His name was now a local legend, a tragic mystery that seemed to be forgotten by the world. But in August 2022, everything changed. 2 foremen, Mark Collins and Dave Miller, were working under contract with the U.S. Forest Service in a remote section of the Tongass National Forest. Their task was to assess the condition of trees in an area untouched for decades. The 2 men were experienced professionals. They knew the forest like the back of their hands, but this particular sector was notoriously difficult to navigate. The terrain was treacherous, and trails were non-existent. They spent several days deep in the forest, far from any known tourist routes. Their work was tedious, but it required them to push through dense undergrowth, thick brambles, and swampy areas. It was exhausting. One evening, as they made their way through a dense patch of spruce trees, Mark stopped to check the map. He noticed something out of place, something that didn't belong in the natural chaos of the forest. High above, wedged between 4 massive tree trunks, was a rectangular shape. It looked unnatural, almost too perfect. Mark called Dave over, and together they approached the strange sight. The curiosity was overwhelming. At about 12 feet above the ground, they could see a wooden structure, an old, weathered cabin. The planks were covered in moss, and the entire structure was suspended, as if floating among the trees. But there was no ladder. Without a way up, the two men were intrigued. This wasn't the type of structure they expected to find in the wilderness. Old hunters' huts or gold miners' shelters were common, but this was different. Mark, being the more experienced of the two, decided to investigate. He strapped on his climbing gear and began the climb, using special spikes designed for tree climbing. Dave watched from below, his curiosity piqued. After several minutes, Mark reached the cabin. He tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Something was wrong. The door seemed sealed shut. Mark walked around the small cabin, inspecting it from every angle. The cabin had no windows, only narrow slits between the boards. Mark shone his flashlight through one of these slits. Inside, it was pitch black, filled with the smell of dampness and rot. His curiosity deepened. He returned to the door and attempted to push it open with his shoulder. The old wood creaked, and after a few more attempts, one of the boards broke loose. The door creaked open slowly. What he saw inside was chilling. At first, Mark thought he was looking at a body, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized it wasn't a body at all. It was a human skeleton, propped up against the wall, wearing tattered clothes. The sight was surreal. The skeleton was positioned as if it had been placed carefully, its head tilted unnaturally toward its chest. Mark froze, unsure of what to make of the macabre discovery. Inside the cabin, Mark also found a backpack, modern and well-preserved, similar to those sold in stores only a decade ago. A small metal pot lay nearby, filled with a dried, petrified mass that looked like porridge. But the most shocking discovery came when Mark noticed something on the door. The door was boarded up from the inside. Someone had sealed themselves in. The nails were bent and the boards had been nailed from the inside. It was clear that whoever had been inside the cabin had locked themselves in. But why? What had happened? The questions swirled in Mark's mind as he stepped back from the unsettling sight. This was no ordinary find. He quickly climbed back down and told Dave about the discovery. His voice was shaken, and Dave immediately understood that something was wrong. The two men knew they needed to call for help. This wasn't something they could handle on their own. Using a satellite phone, they managed to contact the authorities. They reported their coordinates and explained the discovery, ensuring that an investigation team would be dispatched to examine the site. Mark's heart raced as he waited. The investigation team arrived, fully equipped with climbing gear and forensic experts. They carefully made their way up to the cabin, documenting everything. The forensic team meticulously examined the scene, looking for any clues that might explain what had happened. Inside the backpack, they found an ID card belonging to Patrick O'Hara. The mystery that had lingered for almost a decade was now solved. The skeleton was identified as Patrick, and the search for answers was about to begin in earnest. But the discovery raised even more questions. Forensic experts found an almost full supply of freeze-dried food in Patrick's backpack, along with an unopened gas canister. If he had enough food, why had he died? Something didn't add up. The boarded-up door was another strange detail. Why had Patrick sealed himself in? If he had been alone, why would he have barricaded himself in a small, isolated cabin? The mystery of his final moments began to grow more complex. The investigation into Patrick's death had only just begun, and the more they uncovered, the more baffling it became. The forest had held its secrets for so long, but now the truth was slowly starting to emerge. As they examined the remains, experts confirmed that Patrick had not died from starvation. There were no signs of scurvy or malnutrition. He had plenty of food, and his body showed no signs of prolonged hunger. This discovery raised a chilling new theory. The cause of death was confirmed as hypothermia. Despite the food, Patrick had died of the cold. The cabin, perched high above the ground, had no insulation, and the cold night air had taken its toll. But that wasn't the whole story. The most startling discovery came when the forensic team examined Patrick's skull. There was a thin fracture line at the back of his head, a sign that he had suffered a blow to the head shortly before his death. The injury was serious, but not fatal. The puzzle pieces were beginning to come together. Patrick hadn't simply wandered into the cabin and died by accident. He had been injured, possibly knocked unconscious, and then trapped. But who had done this to him? And why? The discovery of the cabin had solved one mystery, but it had opened up a whole new set of questions. The circumstances surrounding Patrick's death were becoming more sinister, and the investigation was far from over. As the investigation into Patrick O'Hara's death continued, the authorities began to focus on the details that didn't add up. The boarded-up door, the intact backpack, and the lack of any clear explanation for his death. Forensic experts concluded that Patrick hadn't died from starvation, as initially suspected. The freeze-dried food in his backpack was still nearly untouched, and there were no signs of severe malnutrition. So why did he die? The cause of death was clear: hypothermia. The cabin, though a temporary shelter, wasn't designed for survival. It sat suspended high in the trees, exposed to the cold and damp air. The nights were frigid. What didn't make sense, however, was why Patrick had died when he had enough food to survive. Even more perplexing was the injury to his skull, a fracture caused by blunt force trauma. This injury seemed to point to foul play. The blow to Patrick's head wasn't fatal in itself, but it was severe enough to cause a concussion, disorientation, and possible loss of consciousness. What had happened in those final moments? The more the authorities looked into Patrick's final days, the more the scenario seemed to unravel. His carefully packed gear, his decision to leave the campsite without taking essential supplies, nothing seemed to align with his methodical nature. If he had been injured and disoriented, he might have stumbled upon the cabin. But why would he then lock himself inside? And why would he barricade the door? Could he have been hiding from something? These questions began to suggest a darker possibility. Patrick hadn't been alone in the woods. He may have encountered someone who posed a threat. The injuries and the locked door hinted at something more sinister. Theories began to emerge. Perhaps Patrick had crossed paths with poachers. The Tongass was known for illegal hunting, and some believed that poachers had been operating in the area for years, hidden in the vast wilderness. It made sense. Patrick was an experienced hiker, but he might have unknowingly stumbled upon something dangerous. Maybe he had seen something he wasn't supposed to, something that led to his tragic fate. One key detail kept surfacing during the investigation: the cabin. The authorities learned that similar structures had been built by poachers in the past, hidden high up in the trees to avoid detection. Could this cabin be one of those? The poachers' cabins were known for being difficult to access. They often didn't leave behind permanent ladders, making it nearly impossible for anyone to enter or leave without the poachers' help. The mystery deepened. Investigators also learned that poachers sometimes left traps for unwitting hikers, leading them into remote areas where they could control the situation. This theory was starting to fit with the evidence found at the scene. Patrick could have been lured into the forest by someone with ulterior motives. After all, the forest was vast and empty, and if he had encountered poachers, there would be no one around to help him. The injury to Patrick's skull, followed by his frantic attempt to barricade the door, painted a picture of a man who had been terrified. But who was he hiding from? What had driven him to such desperation? The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit, but one crucial question remained unanswered. If Patrick had been locked in the cabin by someone else, how did that person escape? The boarded-up door didn't make sense. As the authorities pieced together the timeline, a chilling thought crossed their minds. Patrick could have been deliberately trapped. The poachers, if they had been involved, might have left him to die slowly from cold and injury. The forensic experts continued their analysis of the scene, examining every detail, but there were no fingerprints, no signs of struggle in the immediate area. The poachers, if they were involved, had been careful. The case was growing more complex. One theory emerged that seemed to explain everything. What if Patrick had been deliberately injured by the poachers, knocked unconscious, and then taken to the cabin? The poachers would have used the cabin to trap him, leaving him to die alone. This theory suggested that Patrick had witnessed something he wasn't meant to see, a poaching operation perhaps. The poachers, fearing he would report them, decided to deal with him in the most effective way possible: isolation and slow death. The investigation now seemed to be on the verge of a breakthrough. The circumstances of Patrick's death were tragically clear, but the identities of those responsible remained a mystery. No one had seen them, and the evidence was scarce. The authorities began to focus on possible suspects, looking into any reports of poaching in the Ketchikan area during the summer of 2013. They combed through the archives, speaking to locals, but the trail was cold. The poachers were professionals. As they dug deeper into the records, they found no direct evidence linking anyone to the crime. The suspects were elusive, their tracks carefully covered. It seemed that the poachers were either long gone or had never been caught in the first place. With each passing day, the investigation reached an impasse. The authorities had a coherent theory of what had happened to Patrick, but without concrete evidence or witnesses, they were left with little to go on. The mystery of Patrick O'Hara's death had not been solved, and the case was left hanging in the balance. For the O'Hara family, it was a devastating blow. They finally had answers, but no justice. The questions surrounding Patrick's death would never fully be answered. The poachers, if they existed, remained at large, and the chilling truth of what happened that fateful day in 2013 would likely never be revealed. The investigation was officially closed once again, but the haunting mystery remained. Patrick O'Hara's death had been a tragedy, one that would forever linger in the air like the fog that covered the forest that claimed him. As the investigation seemed to reach a dead end, detectives began to reconsider the evidence, looking at the case from a different angle. The circumstances surrounding Patrick's death were so strange, so out of place. Despite all their best efforts, the evidence pointing to poachers seemed insufficient. No clear suspects had emerged. No fingerprints or physical evidence had been found at the scene. The case remained frustratingly unresolved. But as the investigation team combed through Patrick's belongings and examined the scene again, they started to realize that perhaps they were overlooking something. There was more to this case than just poaching. One aspect of Patrick's death that stood out was the meticulous way his camp had been packed up before he disappeared. The precision with which his gear had been organized didn't fit the profile of someone caught off guard. It wasn't just the neatness of the campsite that raised eyebrows. It was also Patrick's decision to leave without his sleeping bag, food, and map. Why would an experienced hiker leave these essential items behind? As investigators dug deeper into Patrick's background, they learned that he was known for being methodical and cautious, traits that had always kept him safe during previous solo trips. This new detail raised an unsettling question. Could it be that Patrick hadn't left his camp voluntarily? What if something had happened that forced him to leave, something that had caused him to forget or leave behind essential survival gear in his haste? The idea that Patrick had been coerced or forced to leave his camp suddenly seemed plausible. Maybe, just maybe, he hadn't walked into the woods looking for adventure. He had been running from something. The theory gained weight as more information about Patrick's final moments came to light. The injury to his head, a blow serious enough to cause concussion and disorientation, suggested that he had been attacked. But who had done this? For weeks, investigators turned the case over in their minds, looking for any clue that could explain Patrick's actions. And then they found something that seemed to fit. It was a detail in the report from the search. The report mentioned that the search team had found no sign of struggle at the campsite, no signs of a violent altercation. But there was something else. The lack of any visible tracks. This detail stood out like a beacon. The absence of tracks around Patrick's camp was highly unusual, especially considering the wet conditions. If he had left his camp voluntarily, there would have been footprints. Yet, there was nothing. Not a single footprint on the damp ground. This new clue led investigators to reconsider their theory. Perhaps Patrick hadn't left the campsite by choice. Maybe he had been taken, or worse, forced to leave by someone or something unknown. Could he have been abducted? This theory shifted the investigation's focus away from poaching and pointed toward something darker. The idea of an abduction suggested that Patrick's disappearance was not a random accident. Someone may have been lurking in the forest, waiting for him. The lack of struggle, the missing tracks, and the strange circumstances surrounding his head injury painted a clearer picture of what might have happened. Patrick had encountered something or someone, and he had been taken by surprise. As they examined the facts with this new perspective, investigators considered the possibility that Patrick had been targeted for some reason. But why? What would lead someone to abduct an experienced hiker in the wilderness? The more investigators thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to align. The idea that Patrick had been ambushed and taken by force, possibly by someone familiar with the forest, seemed to make sense. The investigation team realized that this new theory could explain the inconsistencies in the case. It also fit with the chilling discovery of the cabin. Patrick could have been taken there to die, trapped high in the trees with no way to escape. With the abduction theory in mind, the investigators now had to ask a different set of questions. Who could have been in the forest with Patrick that day, and why would someone want to trap him? The theory of abduction offered a potential answer to some of the most perplexing questions surrounding Patrick's death. It also suggested that there were people in the forest who had been actively hiding their actions, carefully covering their tracks. As they worked tirelessly to uncover new evidence, the team realized that the case was far from over. They now had a new direction, a fresh perspective that could unlock the mystery of Patrick's final days. Though it was an unsettling thought, the investigators knew they were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Patrick's death was no longer just an accident in the wild. It was the result of something much more deliberate. With the abduction theory taking root, the investigation shifted in an entirely new direction. Detectives focused on anyone who might have been in the forest at the time Patrick disappeared, hoping to find a lead. As the case expanded, investigators began reaching out to locals who had spent time in the Tongass National Forest. They spoke to hunters, hikers, and anyone familiar with the area, trying to uncover new clues or sightings. The more they spoke to locals, the clearer it became that poaching was rampant in the region. Several hunters had reported strange activity in the woods around the time Patrick vanished. Could this be connected? Reports of illegal hunting operations in the area weren't new. The Tongass was known to be a prime hunting ground for poachers, and the dense forest provided the perfect cover for illicit activities. Could Patrick have stumbled upon such an operation? The investigators focused their attention on the poaching theory once again. But this time, it was different. The possibility that Patrick had witnessed illegal activity and been silenced was becoming more plausible with every passing day. The interviews with locals uncovered an alarming detail. Poaching groups operating in the Tongass had been known to set up traps for anyone who might stumble across their operations. These poachers didn't want witnesses. They would go to great lengths to keep their secret. Detectives dug deeper into the history of the area and found that in the 1980s and 1990s, poachers had built structures like the cabin Patrick had been found in. They used them as hideouts to avoid detection by authorities. This discovery seemed to confirm the earlier theory that Patrick had been trapped in the cabin by someone who didn't want him to leave. But the questions kept multiplying. Who were these poachers, and could they still be active? Investigators examined reports of poaching in the region around the time Patrick disappeared. They found a handful of names, but nothing definitive. The poachers were skilled at covering their tracks, leaving no evidence behind. The lack of physical evidence at the scene remained a major obstacle. The cabin itself was a crucial piece of the puzzle, but it offered no clear answers. Who had built it, and why was it still standing after all these years? Despite the challenges, detectives kept pushing forward. They reviewed old Forest Service maps, hunting records, and even spoke to retired rangers who had worked in the area during the 1980s and 1990s. They needed to find any trace of the poachers. They soon discovered that the cabin's design was not only functional, it was also cleverly hidden. Built high in the trees, the structure was nearly impossible to spot from the ground, making it an ideal hideout for anyone wishing to remain undetected. As the team continued to gather information, they realized the cabin's construction was linked to a specific group of poachers who had once operated in the area. These poachers had been known for using remote, inaccessible locations to carry out their illegal activities. The connection between the cabin and the poaching operation was growing stronger. It seemed increasingly likely that Patrick had inadvertently come across something he wasn't meant to see. The question was, did he make it out alive before his encounter with the poachers? The idea that Patrick had witnessed a poaching operation, then been trapped in the cabin as a result, was starting to take shape. Investigators began working on a theory that involved a group of poachers targeting Patrick for what he might have seen. But even with the new theory, there was still no concrete evidence. The poachers had covered their tracks well. The lack of physical evidence, combined with the isolation of the forest, made it nearly impossible to find any direct links to the crime. The investigation continued, though, with renewed vigor. Detectives interviewed more people, pieced together more clues, and examined every detail surrounding Patrick's disappearance. Every new piece of information brought them one step closer to the truth. For the O'Hara family, the investigation's progress was bittersweet. They had waited 9 long years for answers, and while the detectives were closing in on a possible explanation, the emotional toll was still immense. As the investigation delved deeper into the possibilities of Patrick O'Hara's disappearance, one unsettling theory emerged. His death may not have been an unfortunate accident, but something much more deliberate. The pieces were falling into place. The more detectives looked at the evidence, the clearer it became that Patrick had not simply wandered into the forest and gotten lost. Something had driven him off course. Something that left him vulnerable and alone in a dangerous place. His decision to leave without essential gear, the sleeping bag, food, and map, was increasingly seen as something more than a mistake. Patrick, the experienced hiker, knew the importance of these items. So why had he abandoned them? The injuries found on Patrick's body were another crucial detail that kept investigators from reaching a definitive conclusion. His skull had been fractured, suggesting a blow severe enough to cause disorientation and possibly unconsciousness. But who had struck him? The theory of poachers being involved continued to grow stronger as more evidence was uncovered. It became more plausible that Patrick had stumbled upon their illegal activities, and in doing so, put his life in grave danger. Patrick's head injury had occurred shortly before his death, suggesting he had been conscious, at least for a short time after the attack. The signs of panic on his part, boarding up the cabin door, indicated he had been trying to protect himself. The circumstances surrounding the injury and his frantic attempt to seal himself inside the cabin painted a disturbing picture. Patrick had been aware of the danger, possibly even hearing the poachers nearby, which explained his actions. As detectives continued to investigate, they spoke to locals who mentioned rumors of illegal hunting operations near the area where Patrick had disappeared. Could these poachers have been operating under the radar for years without detection? The more they learned about the poachers' tactics, the clearer it became that they had perfected the art of evading detection. The remote locations they used for their operations were nearly impossible to access, leaving no traces behind. One of the key pieces of the puzzle was the cabin itself. The design was simple, yet effective. It was built high in the trees to protect those inside from both wildlife and human threats. But it also served a more sinister purpose. The theory that Patrick had encountered poachers, seen something he wasn't supposed to, and was subsequently silenced by being trapped in the cabin, began to take on a more chilling tone. Could this have been a deliberate execution? With this new perspective, investigators re-examined the scene of Patrick's discovery. The boarded-up door, the lack of struggle, the perfectly packed gear, everything pointed to a tragic tale of a man trying to survive, only to be betrayed by fate. As detectives dug further into the history of the cabin, they found no official record of its existence. It was clear now that it had been built secretly, either to shelter poachers or hide evidence of their crimes. It seemed to have no legitimate purpose. The idea that Patrick had been led to the cabin as a trap, either by someone or by a series of unfortunate events, became more probable. The poachers could have used the cabin as a way to keep him confined, preventing him from escaping. Evidence began to suggest that Patrick's final moments had been a slow, painful death. The cold, the injury, and the isolation all contributed to his demise. Yet the biggest question remained. Who was responsible for setting this trap? The lack of clear suspects weighed heavily on the investigators. Despite their progress, no definitive evidence had been found to pinpoint the poachers or identify the individuals responsible for Patrick's death. The case remained frustratingly open. The possibility of murder, rather than an accident, began to shape the investigation into a far more complex and sinister narrative. Patrick's death was no longer just a case of someone lost in the wilderness. It was the result of calculated malice. But the most chilling aspect was the thought that those responsible for Patrick's death may never be brought to justice. The poachers, if they were involved, had covered their tracks expertly, leaving no evidence to hold them accountable. The investigation reached an impasse once more. Theories abounded, but evidence was scarce. The poachers, if they existed, had vanished into the forest, leaving only the cold, eerie silence of the Tongass behind them. The mystery lingered, unresolved. The haunting nature of Patrick's death, a death that seemed orchestrated by unseen hands, remained a bitter pill for those involved in the investigation to swallow. In the end, the forest may have claimed its final victim in silence. As the case of Patrick O'Hara's mysterious death drew to a close, the haunting realization settled in. The forest had claimed him, and the truth, however close, was still obscured by its vast, impenetrable silence. Investigators had followed every lead, piecing together a theory of poachers, illegal hunting, and a deliberate attempt to silence a witness. Yet, despite their efforts, they found themselves with no suspects, no arrests, and no closure. The chilling details of Patrick's final moments were now clear. He had encountered something in the forest, something that had led to his injury and eventual entrapment in the cabin. But who or what had caused this? The boarded-up door, the lack of struggle, the neatness of his camp, all pointed to an unsettling truth. Patrick had not simply wandered into danger. He had been trapped, possibly by someone with malicious intent. But who? The forest that had once offered Patrick an adventure had become his prison. The trees, silent witnesses to his death, seemed to hold on to the secrets of what had transpired. The cabin, now dismantled, remained a ghostly reminder of his tragic end. For the O'Hara family, the search for answers was over. They now knew the truth. Their loved one had died in the wilderness, abandoned by those who should have protected him. But they would never find justice. Patrick's death had been the result of a series of unfortunate events, intertwined with human greed and cruelty. The poachers, if they had been involved, had covered their tracks so well that they would likely never be found. The local community in Ketchikan was left to mourn, not just for Patrick, but for the knowledge that this type of thing could happen again. The forests of Alaska were vast, and the darkness within them seemed impenetrable. As the case officially closed, the haunting feeling lingered. The theory that Patrick had stumbled upon something dangerous, that he had been silenced to protect a secret, left a chilling mark on all who investigated the case. The poachers, If they were indeed the ones responsible, remained at large. They could have been anyone, locals who knew the forest well, skilled at hiding their tracks, and capable of committing a crime without a trace. The unanswered questions gnawed at the investigators. Why had Patrick been so methodical in preparing for his journey only to be caught in such an unforgiving trap? Why had he been abandoned to die alone in the cabin? The unanswered questions weighed heavily on the authorities. While the official cause of death was hypothermia, the circumstances surrounding Patrick's injury and the sealed cabin door suggested something darker, something deliberate that would never be fully understood. In the years that followed, the story of Patrick O'Hara would remain etched in the memory of the locals. It became a legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking in the wilderness, where even the most prepared hiker could disappear without a trace. Though the investigation had been officially closed, the forest still held its secrets. The silence of the Tongass was as impenetrable as ever, and the mystery of Patrick's death became yet another unsolved enigma in the vast wilderness. For the O'Hara family, there would be no closure, no peace. Their son's tragic fate had been sealed by forces beyond their control, and they would never know the full truth behind his final moments in the unforgiving Alaskan wilds. The forest had claimed Patrick, and it had taken the answers with it. As time passed, the mystery faded from public attention, but the questions would continue to linger, echoing through the trees like a ghostly whisper. In the end, Patrick O'Hara's story became a reminder of the harsh realities of the wilderness, how easily a person could disappear, and how sometimes the truth was lost in the vastness of nature's cruel, silent embrace.